1,200 registrations from 66 countries and 40 speakers on the second ASEAN Environmental Law Conference. Last year, we organised the first ASEAN Environmental Law Conference in January, and we had over 900 participants over the 3 days. And we have a great program for you, so thank you all very, very much for attending. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Joan from the Indigenous People's Rights International, I would like, first of all, to acknowledge the extraordinary support that we've had from the Asian Development Bank and the College of Law, our two principal sponsors and supporters for this event, without whom this conference would not have been possible. And our core supporters and participants, UN Environment Programme, USAID Reducing Demand for Wildlife, the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, and of course the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law. A conference like this takes an enormous amount of preparation and support organising, and I'd like to thank every member of the conference organising team at the beginning of the conference, and we'll also thank you each individually at the end of the conference on Friday afternoon. Last year has been an extraordinary year for all of us. We had thought that COVID-19 would end, that we would move on. It's now slowly happening that we are moving on, but perhaps we are still living with the issues of COVID-19 and the issue of global pandemics. And as we come out of the global pandemic, we are seeing a return perhaps to business as usual. The optimistic views that things would change, that we would learn some of our lessons, may not have happened throughout the planet. Certain areas are bright spots, certain actions that people are taking are paving the way for a transformation of our society. But is it too slow? Is it taking too long? Are the problems too great? Last year, as a consequence of our first conference, Ariel, together with a number of our supporting partners, including the ADB and UNEP, and Law Asia and Earth Rights International, organised a number of events and workshops throughout the year. We ran over 20 different workshops. Rocky Guzman, Deputy Director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and I attended over 70 sessions and gave presentations to a number of different organisations. In addition, we also presented the Ariel Environmental Law Award, one to Iram Asan, the Environmental Law of the Year for Asia, and also Emeritus Professor Ko-King Leng, the Environmental Lawyer of the Year for ASEAN, two outstanding environmental law champions. And that's something that we are continuing to work on and to develop, the idea of promoting and supporting environmental law champions. And we will hear from one of them in a few moments. It's important that we remember and acknowledge the threats facing our blue planet, whether it's plastics in 90% of the world's seabirds, whether it's plastics that have now been found in human blood, whether it's global temperature rise, whether it's 60% in the decline of fish and mammals over the last 40 years, where it's the hundreds of millions of tropical rainforests that have been lost in the last 30 years, whether it's the 55% of oceans covered by industrial fishing, the 85% of wetlands lost since the 1700s, and the significant decline of coral reefs, the 50% lost over the last 40 years. Mangroves, seagrasses, all of those things so vital to the preservation and continuation of Earth's ecosystems. They are still being harmed and damaged, whether by pollution or by plastics or by human endeavours, and then the global consequences of climate change acting as a force multiplier on those particular problems. And so now we turn to the issue of Indigenous people. And we have to acknowledge that Indigenous communities own, manage or use over 28% of the global lands. That includes over 72% of indicator species, over half of all the formerly protected areas in the world, and certainly over 50% or 40% of areas with low human interaction and human consequence. Indigenous people have been the people that have preserved and protected our planet for eons, for thousands and thousands of years. And we have yet to acknowledge and support and truly protect their stewardship and their care and commitment to the planet. One of our key issues must be to formally ensure that Indigenous protection and Indigenous peoples are recognised, protected and supported by our legal system, because it's on them the future of our planet depends. I'd now like to introduce Joan Carling. She is an Indigenous activist from the Codilla, Philippines, with more than 20 years of working on Indigenous issues from the grassroots to the international level. Her expertise includes areas such as human rights, sustainable development, the environment and climate change. She was the General Secretary of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact from September 2008 to December 2016. Ms. Carling was an expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from 2014 to 2016. She was awarded the Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award by the UN Environment Programme in September 2018. She is the convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development from March 2017 to December 21, and she is the founder and currently the Executive Director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. Please welcome Joan Carling.
Good morning to everyone. I am humbled by this invitation to be the keynote speaker to this important second ASEAN Environmental Law Conference. Southeast Asia is acknowledged to have 4 of the 25 global biodiversity hotspots, 3 of the 17 global megadiverse countries, and the most diverse coral reefs in the world. In spite of the commitments of ASEAN member states to biodiversity and environment protection, the alarming trend we see is diminishing biodiversity, aggravated by the impacts of climate change. ASEAN is also the home of more than 100 million indigenous peoples inhabiting 8 of the 10 countries in this region. While there are laws to protect biodiversity and environment in ASEAN, these are often not enforced properly when conflicting with interests of those in power and business groups. Likewise, narrow economic interest and mega profit generation for corporations is allowed to determine developments without accountability for their environmental and social adverse impacts. The economic and so-called sustainable development plans, including COVID recovery plans of governments in ASEAN, contain targets which are oriented more towards resource extraction and unsustainable land use. These plans include the expansion of palm oil plantations through deforestation, with Indonesia and Malaysia in the lead, rubber plantations and other agribusiness through economic land concessions in Cambodia, commercial tourism and related infrastructures development with serious environmental risks, including large-scale mining of coal and other minerals in Thailand, the Philippines, and Myanmar. Mega dams in Myanmar and Lao PDR are also worsening the health of the Mekong River and its tributaries. This river system is the lifeblood of millions of fisher folks, small farmers, and indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia, and its destruction has profound impacts, including on food security of the region. The report of the UN Economic and Social Council for Asia Pacific, UNESCAP, Secretariat on the level of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals after 5 years reveals not just gaps, but even regression in relation to the goals regarding biodiversity conservation, Goal 15, peace and respect for human rights, Goal 16, and reducing inequality within and between nations, Goal 10. The continuing loss of biodiversity instead of protection is precisely the outcome of unsustainable resource extraction, deforestation, expansion of urban areas, and infrastructure development to cater for the demands of investors and corporations. Many of these unsustainable developments are imposed on indigenous territories, resulting in the outright disregard of our rights to lands, territories, and resources, and our sustainable resource management systems and sustainable livelihoods. These impositions to indigenous peoples are resulting in conflicts, loss of livelihoods, hunger, and irreversible damage to the environment. What is appalling is that while corporations and economically powerful families and clans are scot-free in destroying the environment for their own interest, indigenous peoples are criminalized in the name of conservation when we practice our traditional occupations such as hunting, fishing, gathering of non-timber forest products, and shifting cultivation or rotational agriculture. While there is legal recognition of our lands and resources in some countries in ASEAN, what is being implemented are laws and policies that restricts and prohibits our traditional occupations and livelihoods, and which are in violation to our inherent collective rights. Our government is claiming to protect our environment, but why do they continue to issue mining and agribusiness permits when our lands, forests, and resources are devastated by these projects? Mining companies dig out massive holes in our territories, bring home our minerals, and leave us with toxic waste, polluted water, and wasted land. As a leader of my village, I will not allow this destruction of our land that will also cause us hunger, conflicts, and disharmony with our environment. How will the future generations survive if our lands, as the source of our life, our culture, and identity, is destroyed? Likewise, when my neighbor cut some trees to build the house of her daughter, he was arrested and sentenced to jail for 10 years. Why is there a double standard when we are in fact the ones nurturing our environment for the future generations? This statement of an indigenous leader from the Cordillera region, where I come from, resonates the general sentiment of indigenous peoples in relation to laws and policies relating to our lands and resources, as well as to the environment. Indigenous peoples are often squeezed out of our lands and resources for extraction on one hand and conservation on the other hand. And these activities are often supported by laws and policies which are in conflict in the recognition and practice of our collective rights. When indigenous peoples resist these impositions and demand the protection of our rights, we are called anti-development on one hand and enemies of conservation on the other hand. The systemic discrimination we suffer also undermines our roles and contributions in sustainable resource management and the protection of the environment as integral to our well-being and collective survival. The in-depth study across South Asian countries and beyond, conducted in cooperation with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization on the traditional practice by indigenous peoples of shifting cultivation with 7 to 10 years of cycle, evidence that this traditional practice enhances biodiversity and food security with 60 to 80 types of food crops generated in even less than a hectare of land. It has also proven to sequester more carbon in the regenerated soil compared to the emission when the burning of small plots of land. However, this sustainable practice is legally restricted or prohibited in ASEAN countries and beyond, thereby causing criminalization of practitioners. This is resulting in disproportionate representation of indigenous peoples in jail, such as in Thailand and Indonesia. Another alarming development is the intimidation, harassment, and killings of indigenous leaders and other environmental defenders, as when we demand the accountability and expose structural problems causing environmental destruction. According to the Asia-Pacific Network of Environment Defenders, there are many environment defenders in Southeast Asia coming from different sectors: forest rangers, indigenous leaders, community leaders, leaders of non-government organizations, workers, women, human rights defenders, and journalists who are under attack for standing up for the environment, their right to life, and the freedom to live in harmony with nature. These attacks include harassment, arrests, arbitrary detention, false criminal charges, and killings. The impunity committed against environment defenders in the ASEAN indicates the lack of political will and effective mechanisms to prevent these attacks and uphold the right to a healthy environment for all. As the theme of the conference calls for turning principles into practice for environment protection, indigenous peoples play a central role in this needed and urgent transformation. Evidence has shown that lands and resources managed by indigenous peoples are better conserved, richer in biodiversity, and provides healthier environment. These are attributed to the sustainable resource practices and application of the principles and values of reciprocity and do no harm to the environment, simple lifestyle over consumerism, cooperation and mutual support over competition and greed, and accountable governance and sustainable and intergenerational management of resources. The practice of reciprocity means we value our interdependent and intergenerational relations to nature and the environment, meaning living in harmony with nature to sustain our future. The way we treat, interact, and manage our environment will determine the future of the generations to come. This implies that we only use or take the resources that we need, and to be mindful that every action we do with our environment and to each other may have consequences. In my culture as Kankanaey, we call this inayan. It serves as a constant reminder to not be wasteful and to be more caring to the environment. Our sustainable resource management systems also include customary regulations and guidelines for collective conservation and accountability of users and the indigenous community as a whole. One example is the practice of SASI as a customary system of resource management, such as fishing, for indigenous peoples in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Timor-Leste. This practice entails regulations and restrictions on the use of resources, sharing of harvest to the poorest, to widows and orphans. It ensures the transfer of traditional knowledge from elders to the youth, facilitates community actions for the protection of resources, and community festivals as thanksgiving for receiving the bounty of nature, among others. Indigenous peoples continue to practice sustainable management systems under an ecosystems approach in acknowledging the interconnectedness of living things. For example, the protection of the watershed will mean more supply of water to irrigate rice fields and agricultural lands. More trees and plants would feed the wildlife, and more biodiversity also means more source of herbal and traditional medicines. Many indigenous peoples living in forests would say the forest is their supermarket, their clinic, their playground, their church, and the source of their spirituality and distinct identities. The Karen indigenous peoples as forest peoples in Thailand and Myanmar would tie the umbilical cord of their baby to a bamboo tree, and that bamboo tree is considered as the sibling of the baby, and that they will grow up together to nurture the environment. It is also vital to recognize the roles of indigenous women in resource management and sustainable food systems, including as keepers of seeds, of traditional knowledge, and practitioners of conservation systems, traditional medicines, among others. The common practice of mutual cooperation and sharing of labor also enhances the community unity and solidarity of indigenous peoples in collectively and sustainably managing their resources. This practice promotes equity and strengthens community resilience in addressing calamities and disasters, including the impacts of climate change. As we tackle the urgent need to protect the environment and save the planet for all of humanity by putting into practice the principles and values of indigenous peoples, we need to reorient our economy from extractive approach to sustainable and equitable models of resource management. Actions to stop deforestation should be implemented, and biodiversity conservation efforts of indigenous peoples, small farmers, and fisher folks need to be supported while ensuring their sustainable livelihoods. And to fully implement environmental regulations, stop greenwashing and misinformation and deception by business and corporations. Likewise, states should operationalize mechanisms for accountability, including effective systems of polluters pay principle. It is also imperative that the recognition of the roles and contributions of indigenous peoples as stewards of nature are translated into legal recognition and protection of our rights to lands, territories, and resources that will allow us to continue the practice of our sustainable resource management systems and values, and to be at the driving seat in conservation efforts and biodiversity protection. Finally, each of us can be an actor in protecting our environment by going out of our comfort zones and contribute to the urgent actions and social movements to save our planet. Thank you and good day to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that amazing and inspirational presentation, Joanne. And I would like to also say that we are now moving into our first session of the day, which will deal with environmental and human rights defenders, to be chaired by Dr. Georgina Lloyd of UN Environment Programme. So can I ask you all if you are able to go back to the lobby, and once we end this session, we will then move into the second session, or the first session of today, on environmental and human rights defenders. And that means going back into the lobby, and then you'll be able to click on the second session, or the session 1, which will start in a few minutes. We will also have an attendance sheet to be completed, and all of the presentations and PowerPoints that will be delivered over the next 3 days are going to be put together in a book that will then be an electronic book that will then be available at the end of April. Thank you again very much. Welcome to the second ASEAN